How are your stocks doing today, Peter?
I don't check the stock market.
You don't?
We're in like a recession, then we're not in a recession, and it's like there's some fancy term when it like spikes up.
Didn't they change the definition of a recession?
It's, too much.
I wish I still had some student debt so I could get some Kizash.
Hey, you can go take some on.
I think we get
I'll lend you some money.
There you
and call
go.
it student debt.
We'll do that again, and then we'll hire some people and get the relief. There's like another relief package coming to employers who have people on payroll. Too bad.
So what does your business do? We just abuse programs.
We were never got to the level where we could really put people on payroll. But we should have gone in the red doing that, so we get back in the green from the relief package.
Okay. Solid business plan there.
Cool. Welcome to Front End First. We are going to be talking about some stuff today. Well, we've been working on a new project. That's what we're most excited about, and we want to talk more about it, but we're probably going to wait a week. But it's going to be live soon.
I hate when you do this. It's a little tease. I hate it.
But yeah, we're gonna have some more stuff to talk about. But we want to talk about some of the engineering things related to testing this time with that project. So we've been working on it for about 2 weeks. We're trying like the 6-week cycle, I guess. Like, what can we fit into 6 weeks? We started 2 weeks ago. I guess this is week 3, or week 2 or something like that. And it's fun with Vercel, makes it so easy to have preview branches. We got our DNS wired up, so we have the domain and everything. And something we like to do, I think we've talked about this before in the podcast, what we like to do at the beginning of a project is, instead of getting a bunch of stuff working locally and then deploying it, it's like, let's get the web page working, let's get Tailwind installed, everything configured the way we like it, TypeScript build, blah, blah. Get it hooked up to GitHub, and get it deploying on Merge. Because that's like the workflow we want. Because then once you take care of that stuff at the beginning, there's going to be things you add later on that make that more complicated, like running tests or resetting your database or whatever. And so you get to amortize that cost as you add those features once they show up. But right now we don't even have a backend, a database yet, because we want to ship a version of the site that doesn't need it first, and then add the database once we need a feature that needs the database.
It's very easy to get like a first task and be like, oh, I need all this infrastructure.
Yeah.
And so, I think our first step is always like, well, what can you do today? And at the end of the day, get it deployed.
Right.
And because those, like, you just don't want deployment surprises at the end of a 6-week cycle.
Right. Because then it would be an 8-week cycle.
Yeah.
But it feels really good how fast we're moving. I'm really happy with like our tech choices and the stack and everything, especially compared to like when we started EmberMap 6 years ago. It's pretty awesome. There's a lot of really cool stuff that's come out. One thing though that is still kind of like an open question with like the stack we use is the testing story, and that was always like a big focus of both like Rails community and the Ember community. Mm-hmm. And we still didn't have like a perfect story there, but it was good enough. Definitely good enough.
Both Rails and Ember, I think they like testing is first class.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. But this is like, it's a really interesting problem. It's a tough problem when you kind of take the approach we're taking with this stack, which is basically like services, using services for things like sending emails, whether it's MailChimp or Drip, using a service like a Hasura for your backend, using a service like Firebase for your auth, Stripe for your checkout. So we already have like 5.
Yeah.
Right? And so, there's this principle that was really like impactful to me, I think, from like the Thoughtbot days of their blogging and teaching online and podcasting, where they were a consultancy that was big in the Rails community, and they always talked about testing, and the whole TDD thing was like one part of it, which wasn't as important to me, but what was important to me was this idea that like you're always testing your app. It's just whether you're doing it manually. And like, that's so obvious to me now, but I remember it being really impactful when I first heard that.
I still love it when I hear it, man.
It's true, because it reminds you of like, it's kind of like that life lesson of like not making a decision is still making a decision. You're like, shoot, I can't escape this, And it just helps you. It helps remind you. So when you are clicking around something, even if it's new, and seeing if the checkout button works in test mode, you're testing. And the question is just whether you're doing it manually over and over again, or you have some automated way to do it. Now, when we worked on Ember apps with like a Rails, so if you work on like a Rails app, a standard like SSR app that comes with like a batteries included framework like a Rails or a Laravel, you have most of the pieces there, and so you control them. And so testing is built into it in a sense because the story is kind of like local first, and you run everything, and usually the add-ons or libraries or ecosystems have thought about that since you kind of are responsible for it.
And although you can use services in Rails, the Rails community has like adopted this kind of this culture of you use gems, and the gems do things locally. So for example, you want to use auth instead of using Firebase auth like we're using. Typical Rails setup would use like Devise.
Right.
And Devise comes with a whole bunch of test helpers.
Right.
It doesn't need an internet connection, doesn't need to talk to Firebase's servers.
Right.
So it's like super easy to test.
Right. And that's really nice, especially when you get into like a data-driven website, which is kind of like what we are. It's not as unique and personal and data-driven as like a piece of accounting software, but there are definitely different states in the app. And, at Ember Map, once we had added like the last feature we were going to add there, I guess, there was definitely plenty of states that you'd want to be able to put the app in when you're building new features. You want to see what the homepage looks like for someone who has an account or who doesn't, someone who has watched a certain video or hasn't, and someone who's an admin. So there's already a combination there of 8 different things or whatever it is.
Yep.
So the way you do that in Rails with everything completely locally, there's like some answers there where you can like seed your database in different scenarios. When we were doing Ember and Rails, we would mock out backend APIs so that you could actually just run the front end and put the front end in different scenarios. That was really cool when we started doing that because you kind of realize like this contract between your front end and your back end is like basically fixed. Once you kind of use standard enough tools, we use like JSON API resources. And so that was like, it's kind of like the contract is not yours. You're not writing it. We weren't writing like these bespoke data payloads that you would always end up causing bugs because we were like being inconsistent.
Right.
We're using a library that did consistent payloads. So once the JSON made it to the Ember front end, that's really where 80 to 90% of your work is. Yep. The back end became like dumber and dumber in that sense, almost like a SQL database is to a Rails app. And so in Rails, in the same way that like you just want to get your active record model seeded, and you can put your app in a different state, we do the same thing with our SPAs in Ember. And we've done that with some React apps too, because it's the same thing, the same idea. Basically, if you're using a standard enough API like a Hasura or a Firebase, you don't really care about the data going over the wire in a sense. I mean, you want to account for all the situations, but you don't need to like start off, give me a Firebase server that has a user that has this, and then look at the front end. Because that's the problem with these services. There's so many moving parts. A lot of times it's easier to just cut off at the boundary. And what I really want to do is make my React components behave in a way that it would for an admin or something like that.
Right. I think a tricky thing with services is you don't know where the boundary is, and you don't necessarily own the boundary. So we decided that our Rails app was going to use JSON API resources. So we knew like that was a contract. We don't know how the Firebase JavaScript SDK communicates with Firebase's servers. Now, of course, we could always go like look at the network tab and mock that out, but we're opening the hood at that point. Like that's not public API, and they could always change that, and that's going to leave us in a really bad spot. So I think that's like one of the really hard things about testing services. And then also
services you don't own, because Ember to Rail is basically services, but you own both of them.
Yep. And then
so you get a clean boundary.
The more services you get, the services need to talk to each other via like webhooks and their backends. And so it's not just the Rails app sending JSON down to the SPA. It's now Firebase and Hasura communicating auth status with each other.
Right.
Stripe sending webhooks into Hasura, and just you get like that exponential
explosion, a combinatorial
Yes.
explosion of
everything that can talk to each other.
right.
Yeah. And it is interesting that like you look at these services and you think, wow, like I'm going to be flying. I get auth super quickly. I get, database super quickly.
And you do. I mean,
You do, yeah. And that first, that weekend
Yeah.
code you write.
Look at the first day we were doing Stripe. I mean, we had
Yeah.
more features than we ended up with Ember
Yeah.
because of Stripe checkout after writing like 5 lines of code in 2 different webhooks.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a testing. You don't, at least I don't feel like I'm paying for it by sacrificing testing until I need to write a test. And
Right.
then I kind of end up in this, now I need to like architect a whole test suite, like how do I get all these things tested? Where do I mock? And it feels very architecture heavy.
Yeah, you're not working on your app anymore. The best part about the service is like, I need customer account management. Boom, drop a line of code in and you're done. And it's like, that's the same for every app. Every subscription site should basically have the same options for users who have subscriptions. And that's like where you want to be as an app developer, is like working on app code and like not doing plumbing. And so that's great. But like you said, it's like the plumbing cost comes when you need to do tests. I mean, because we were clicking around, like to verify everything worked, we were clicking around the Stripe checkout and test mode in our dev server. So we did that because we didn't know if what we wrote worked. So we did that, and until we were confident the integration was correct, and we checked that things were updated in the Stripe dashboard, just making sure it all works like anyone would do. But that question is like, okay, once you're in this is a case where once you're in the Stripe portal, the customer portal or whatever, or the checkout flow, you don't care about all those states because that's what they handle, right? Mm-hmm. But so that is something that's like, I think Ryan Florence had this tweet one time where he said, some code is, services are hard to set up because you have this kind of initial code. It can be confusing. It's hard to hold in your head. Okay, we have authenticated backend with Hasura to Firebase that has our token. Now we need to check out. A user needs to have an account in Hasura for us so we can give them access to videos, and they need to be authenticated with Firebase. But when they click checkout to subscribe, we need to know that that was like a trusted message, and that this trusted piece of data, which is like the verified user ID, gets back to us. And it's like confusing. It's like if you draw the flow, it's like confusing to understand. How do you send the user ID that you know is verified in a secure way? Okay, there's like this property on Stripe called
Client
reference ID that comes back, and so that's how it's like we talked through it, and like, I mean, it would have been hard for me to do it by myself. Like, just it's good to talk through it, right? And we got there, but it's like I think he called it like an infrastructure, like an upfront infrastructure cost, which is like, these are just more complicated than like the setup flow that a devise gem and Rails can give you, because they control more of it. Stripe checkout needs to work with like anything, so they need to have a lower level enough thing. Whereas like devise knows it's mounted in a Rails app. It knows how to get a user. It knows how to query the database and access a session and all that stuff. So there's like this infrastructure upfront cost that comes with these services. And then that's compared to like an architecture cost, which is if you were to take ownership of this code and this flows that like a service can take care of for you, you end up writing a lot more code yourself. You understand it, it's easier to test, but it's complex and it's a lot more code. So there's this cost that's kind of there over the lifetime of the project.
Yep.
So and he was saying there's a benefit there, and I was agreeing, nodding my head when I was reading it, because even if it feels like I don't fully understand this, it's 5 lines of code in your app or whatever, and it's never going to change, basically. You know what I'm saying? But then you have this problem, right? Which is like, we're clicking to test around that it works. Okay, it works, it feels good, and this is mostly done up front. Like, mostly once this is going, we don't need to test that the customer portal, we don't need to test any of the customer portal's features every time we deploy our app, right? Because we don't write those features.
Right.
So that's the benefit. We don't need to cover the features that the service provides in our test suite, because
we don't want to say I can visit stripe.com
and change,
enter a new credit card number, because we know that Stripe has
exactly.
tests for that. And if like
Yeah.
We're choosing Stripe
Right,
because
because
that
we
stuff
trust
is
it.
so
Yes,
solid.
exactly. Whereas, you know, like maybe we did have a flow that we tested there. You can cancel a subscription, and we made sure it was canceled or something like that, right? That we wouldn't need now, or some changing your information on Stripe or whatever. So that's the benefit. And it's kind of the same thing we were saying, but I think this is an interesting framing, which is like the infrastructure cost, which is like one time up front, and it can make you feel really out of your element, you know? Like imagine we use like a new cron service to send something every whatever. Like it's going to feel weird compared to what we would know how to do already in Rails and Heroku or whatever. But like you get it set up and then it just works, and that's cool. But then on the flip side is like this other stuff. You know what I'm saying? It's that's a benefit, but then the flip side is
it's a testing.
Exactly.
I think it's easy to fall into a trap of you pay that upfront infrastructure cost, and then now you're right back to architecting again, because you need to architect a system where you can test that when a Stripe account gets canceled on Stripe system, it actually flows through back into our system correctly. And that's something we do need to test. We do need to know, like when someone cancels their account, it's more cancels like we're going to take the videos away. What we really need to test is when someone buys something, now they have access to everything. So we have to figure out how do we write a test for that?
Yeah. And it might be the case, as often has, that it turns out having an automated test that verifies a flow that covers 5 services is not actually realistic or practical to write. So you end up just writing some testing around like the hook, like the webhook somehow, right? Instead of like actually spinning up a test Firebase account, a test Hasura account, and your test Stripe account, and making sure all those things work together. Again, like it's just kind of there's a tension there somewhat where not a tension, but there is a tension, but there's also an argument that you shouldn't, if you cover the integration, the stuff that works together, like yes, we rely on Stripe sending a webhook to our serverless functions in our next app in order to get people subscribed. Are we going to have a test that runs every time we deploy that says, I'm an anonymous user, I click checkout, and then I can watch a premium video? That's the kind of test we would write in EmberMap.
Yeah.
And I don't think so. I think the answer is no, because there's just like, it's the trade-off you're making.
So I don't know. I want to figure out an answer to this. For me, I need to be able to take a shot of tequila at like 5 p.m. on
and
Friday, deploy, and then rip another shot. That, like no, seriously, I need to. And so
that's what we do every Friday, right?
But if there's going to be a voice in the back of my head that's like, oh, don't deploy because like you've changed some Hasura code, which the webhook could affect, and like really you should test this, and by test I mean like walk through it, and just make sure it all works.
Oh, no, you're not in a happy spot.
I'm not going to deploy 100%. because
what's interesting to me, man, is like the webhook stuff. I know it's like what people rely on, but that's actually to me kind of the weird, interesting part of it. That's like, to me, even if you deployed and you walked through it and it worked, the whole time it's running, like you have to wait for a webhook to come from Stripe to Hasura. That feels to me like the fickle part almost, because it's not part of like the request response flow. It's like happening out of band, and you have no way to.
There's more systems that you have to watch. It's more like,
but that's kind of like, well, you just have to trust. Really, I mean, like
you do, and I also trust that like the webhook stuff, like maybe it fails, but Stripe can try it again in 5 minutes. I trust that there's like good solid engineering there.
Yeah,
it's more like we make a change to our database. And that breaks our SQL client that's running in the webhook, but we never directly talk to the webhook, and therefore our webhook's just busted, and we don't actually know. And so I want to figure out a good testing strategy for that. Something that gives me confidence that our webhook is running correctly.
Yeah. Interesting. Mm-hmm. I wonder, like, it's almost like you want.
Also, I should say I'm a big believer. It's someone that like has written a ton of Rails apps with all these gems. Like, I think services are the future. The stuff that you get from all these services, you feel like you're building on like the 30th floor.
I know.
And
That's
so-
why it's worth it. But this is the cost. But
Right, right.
It's unbelievable. Like how
Right.
much code we've written in the past, even for controller endpoints or whatever,
Yeah.
that we've seen gone wrong. Right. The cost, the places that they go wrong there is like just the complexity of it. You know, and the slow joins, or whatever, all the stuff you
It's
get
not,
for
it's not even that. It's just the fact that like I'm never gonna add Apple Pay to my
Right.
5-year-old subscription form, but
Right.
guess what? Stripe is gonna add that the day it comes out,
Right,
and
right,
so
exactly.
it's
Yep.
just you're moving with the speed of Stripe.
Yep. Yep. Are you working for them?
Yeah,
It's pretty good. I like that. That's nice.
Stripe.com/Ryan to get 30% off.
I think so. Okay, we did the Stripe checkout thing, right? When you click purchase, they wait for a response from the webhook, right? Don't they? Wait.
No.
No.
When you click purchase, we generate a Stripe session, and then
When you're in the session and you're checking out in their flow,
we
you
send
put the
them to
credit
the
card
form, yeah.
in, and then you click buy
Yep.
on Stripe.com.
Yep.
Don't they wait for a webhook?
Yep.
That's going to our server.
Yep.
And is that where we fulfill the purchase?
Yeah, they basically.
So if it
say
wasn't listening, it would say,
the form. I think it actually just spins and waits forever, and they get an error.
so this is the case that I worry about, or I think could potentially keep me up, because like, again, so Ember Map did everything from our server. So you make a request to subscribe, we can show you whatever UI you want, but there is a chunk of Ruby code that is doing all this stuff, and it's talking to the server. It's like, to me, it's very different than a webhook. I mean, it is very different than a webhook.
Yeah, it is.
It's like literally await, create subscription with this user. You're in Ruby, you have your auth session, you have your user ID, and then once it works, you get to respond. So it happens in the request response lifecycle. So that just feels, maybe it's just because it's something I'm more comfortable with, but it feels like way more ironclad to me. Whereas here,
The front end is like in the Ruby app. The front end is like the air traffic controller. It's in full control. So
Right.
it says, okay, I'm gonna go send my credit card information off to Stripe, and then get back a token, and I'm gonna take that token, and I'm gonna go send it to the Rails app, and the Rails app is gonna respond.
Right.
And so at any point, if there's an error, there's like a try catch block in the front end, and the front end can say like, oh, there was an error, like,
Yeah.
fire off alerts to us,
Yeah.
whatever it does.
yeah.
But with this webhook world, like we're sending the user like off our domain.
Yeah.
And then the way the user comes back to our domain is like first the Stripe pings our webhook and
Right.
says like, hey, everything worked.
But they're
Goes-
totally out of band. I mean,
yeah,
so,
totally.
yeah,
The user just they're not like, we don't have that air traffic controller that's directing
Right.
everything. I do think there's the benefits
Sure.
to all this, but yeah, it's definitely a lot scarier.
yeah.
And just think about this. Like one way of testing is like is with like monitoring with like Grafana.
Yes.
And just saying like, hey, we haven't had a sign up in 2 weeks.
Yeah, right.
Something's broken.
That's what I was thinking. No, totally. And I think we've heard from folks at like meetups or conference talks from large companies when you get to like a bigger scale, where that's literally the only thing you can do, because they inevitably have services talking to each other.
Yep.
The recommended bookshelf on Netflix is literally coming from an entire like department that's working on that and machine learning and everything. And so they're not going to test that. It's not, it's themselves. They don't own it in the same way we don't own Stripe. And so you have to set up monitoring just to see unusual behavior as a proxy for whether something breaks. I was thinking it even more like, one way you could even think about this is like, it almost, something that would make me more confident would be like, when you click buy now from our website, it's like we create a job or like a record in our back end, and then we can always look and see.
Or they're hanging records.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And there will be some because some
people will cancel.
Get through the flow and then just close the
and
window.
close the window.
Yeah.
Right.
But that is a good way. Like,
But you could
last
also
5.
compare that with like the data in, right? Because the thing that you don't ever want is someone to pay you money and then not have access because of the server-to-server communication broke
Right,
down.
right.
So that's what you'd want to know. You want to see everyone who has paid money, so their Stripe customer has an active subscription, but for whatever reason they don't have it as active flag in our Hasura backend
Yeah.
or whatever.
Yeah.
And I feel like you could do that it would be a lot of work. Like we wouldn't start doing that to do that, right? But
Right. It is a lot of setup. And also too, like for smaller, like you're running Gmail and if you're not sending 1,000 emails a second,
Yeah.
that something's broken. But with us, it's like,
it might be there's enough variance there
yeah.
that you wouldn't know if it was a problem necessarily.
Yeah. Just also too, like another approach here would be like, you have this explosion of services and we know we're going to use more services. So setting up like quote unquote staging accounts where we just have like the Stripe test account and the staging Hasura instance and the staging front end deploy. And that's kind of like a very tightly controlled environment. And we can run a test where we like wipe out the database.
Right.
And then, use Cypress as like Cypress kind of advertises this end-to-end testing
Because it's a black box.
Yeah.
So it might as well be running like it could be running on a production environment for all it knows.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas
it's filling out forms and
Yep.
making sure that it ended up back at the website and it has access to the videos that it bought.
Right.
So
Right.
from Cypress's point of view, and that's really all that matters. It doesn't need to know that like the webhook got fired.
Right.
It just needs to know
The same way the user doesn't.
I filled out a fake credit card and I got in a test environment. I filled out a credit card and I got access to the videos.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I think
So that's one, right. So basically when you have this problem, there's a few ways to deal with it. One is like mocking at the boundaries. Even if you don't mock at the network level, like with Firebase, where you say, I don't know if they use webhooks or HTTP, it's not part of their public API or interface, so we can't like rely on mocking that out. What you do is like you have an object that is the thing, usually like a use current user, that at the very edge of your system, you can put it into a test mode. That means you don't necessarily cover the integration code with Firebase, but usually that's really small and never changes. But you do get to simulate that use current user being in a different state for the rest of your app, which is usually where most of the work is. So you can do that for each service, basically.
But as you get the explosion of services, you actually need the user in Firebase because eventually
the server stuff is like another layer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Stripe might just made up example here, but
Yeah.
Stripe might say, oh, I'm actually going to pull your user info from Firebase. And so we actually need like a Firebase account with a user in it.
Yeah.
Now that doesn't happen today,
It'll be.
but
curious.
Hasura does.
Yeah.
Hasura pulls info from our Firebase instance.
Yeah. Have you ever written a test for any of your apps that have Hasura to Firebase communication for that layer?
I actually mock out. So when Hasura goes to talk to Firebase,
Yeah.
that part is mocked. So that I'm going to go talk to Firebase webhook, knows it's in test mode.
Okay.
And it responds with basically what my test
The
scenario
URL
is.
that you put into.
It's just like what the test scenario is. So I'm
Yeah.
a user. I'm an anonymous user. So then when that goes and talks to Firebase, it says, oh, there's no user here. If I say I'm logged in as Ryan, it goes and talks to Firebase, the thing gets intercepted and comes back.
Right.
But if Stripe ever had to talk to Firebase,
Yeah.
or what are other services we use? What's like a more realistic one, like Stripe? I mean, Stripe could maybe pull
Vimeo,
data.
Cloudinary, or something. I don't know.
Yeah, something like
Let's say Vimeo lets you like make sure this person was verified, like had a subscription, so they would talk to Hasura or something before serving up the video or something. I don't know.
in that case, you would have to like, actually, I don't have a good answer here. I think my answer would be like, you need to black box it, and you need like dummy services. And to be honest with you, like a lot of these services
Don't think about this.
Yeah, it's an afterthought.
Yep.
You need a testing Hasura instance, just set up a second
Yeah.
Hasura instance.
Yep. Firebase was like that for a long time. Only in the last like year or two did they let you run Firebase locally, right?
Yeah.
It's called
The emulator.
emulator.
Yeah.
And that's what they say to do, but it kind of starts bending the benefits backwards, because if that's
your architecture. 'Cause
Yeah.
You're back to architecture.
Yeah, and like the productivity that you get, from using the service in the first place, now you have this huge setup. Whereas it would actually be, if I have to run it locally for development and testing, maybe it's easier to just use the gem in a Rails like ecosystem, because I already know how to install a gem. Whereas this is going to be more complicated again, because it has to work with anything. So there's some trade-offs there too.
Yeah.
But
maybe I mean, just like future thinking, maybe as these services get more popular,
Yeah.
like there is a like one of the features of using this service
Yeah.
is we provide great testing support. And honestly, Stripe.
That's what I was going to say.
is
Stripe
awesome.
has Stripe mock.
Yeah, I think that's community maintained.
Okay, but it's like
still you can throw Stripe in test mode.
Yeah. Oh,
and
yeah.
You can
yeah.
sign up and you can
Yeah.
and you can fire webhooks.
Yeah.
And you don't feel like where with like
No, once we
with
test
Vimeo we can't do that.
Yeah,
like
yeah,
any video we upload to Vimeo, that is our production Vimeo.
No, it's
channel.
true. Like we went through and manually tested, but once we do that and we go to production, we're not going to need to do as much extensive. We might try to buy a thing, make sure everything works, right? But we're not going to have to go through all. We tried changing everything because that's a contract they have. Test mode behaves like production mode, and that's awesome. So, yeah,
And it's solid. Like
And
it's
it's
solid
super-
to the
super
point where
solid.
we like yeah, we're writing all this. All we're going to do is change the API keys and it's going to
Yeah,
work.
exactly.
And we don't need to. That's not what I'm worried about breaking because that's
Right.
code maintained by Stripe.
Right.
What I'm worried about breaking is a code maintained by
Right,
us.
right,
And
right,
that's
right.
that's just it's fast changing code.
Right.
That's why.
Right. I'll be interested to see like where we end up because like we both value this a lot and we've seen the benefits it brings to like code bases when you feel really good about test suite. We like writing tests in order to make it so that we can add things quicker and not worry about breaking stuff.
Yeah.
And so I'll be interested to see where we end up with some of it.
Yeah. Same.
I reached for tests in like my fitness app, which uses Hasern and Firebase first when the UI started getting complicated. And I wanted to be, because it was time based, there's goals. That's like a very dynamic data driven app. And so I wanted to be able to say, okay, give me a goal from last week that was completed on Tuesday and put me in this week. Let me see what the UI is. Like I had to have tests.
Yeah, because you're
You're
not
not gonna-
Monday rolls around
Yeah,
and you can't do any
No, that's what was
development
happening every
because you
Monday
have to go
morning.
set up a whole new entry.
Exactly,
Yeah.
that's exactly what was happening. So that's the kind of testing that I'm used to doing at the app level, where you mock out the time, you have these different scenarios, you freeze the time, and you set some goals and some events you've completed in the past, entries you've put in the past, and that's like indispensable for me for building this stuff. But I still didn't really ever test the Firebase stuff because I set that up once and it's worked ever since for like 2 years now or whatever. But this is going to be more complicated than what I'm doing there. I do some file uploading, next S3 upload.
Nice. Yeah, S3 is another service we use.
Yep.
Just services everywhere. I mean,
Yep.
the services are.
But maybe that's like part of, yeah. We're like very practical when it comes to this stuff. I think there's not a hard answer here.
Right.
Whereas like if you talked to us 6 years ago working on a Rails app, we would have taken the time to test the flows because you could do it. There was an answer. People in the Ember community were like this. I remember Katie was setting up the add-on stuff, and she was working on this way to test add-ons in different Ember versions, you know? And she, to me, like embodied that like philosophy where she was like, I use automated testing for everything because like no matter how long it takes me to figure out how to set it up, I'm going to do it because it's like that's a strong value, and she just knows, especially open source, it's going to pay dividends. So she literally built, talk about infrastructure, right? I mean, this is like open source infrastructure big time. But that was the Ember Try thing where you can run. Yeah, Ember Try. So let's say you know, and this happens now, and React doesn't really have something like this, but let's say we made, what's a popular library for Framer Motion, right? And you want to run tests on Framer Motion against React like 16, 17, and 18. But you also want to run it against like Node 7, 8, and 9 and NPM, whatever. And there's a matrix there. So she made a tool originally, and the community maintains a tool that lets you specify a matrix of all those versions, and it does it because she was doing it manually, right? And she's like, well, we have to automate this. So that's like, to me, an extreme example where you're going to do whatever it takes to get this automated. And so you can imagine doing something similar for an app like the one we're building, where whatever it is to get a reproducible, you know, environment set up, even if it's freaking getting a Docker container with different user scenarios that you can run and test against. Like you could do it, but we're kind of more in the middle in terms of that because it's not going to be always worth it, you know, for the business side of things. And so I'm just kind of interested to see where we end up, you know?
I think we'll probably like mock at the boundaries.
Yeah.
And then guessing we'll have a few end-to-end
with
staging
Yep,
style
I think that's
integration
probably,
tests.
that feels
And
pretty good to me.
yeah. My whole thing is, seriously, I made the joke about tequila, but I'm not going to give up I'm not going to give up tequila. I'm not going to give up Friday night deploys.
Mezcal's pretty good. Yeah, I also feel exactly the same way. I mean, I still feel like to this day, Ember Map is like 6-year-old, started 6 years ago, but still has great test coverage. And if we needed to change, we had to change little things here and there after having not worked on it for like a year or two.
You're right.
And
If it
test passed,
Yep.
deploy it. So, and it's like an active site or whatever. So, yeah, that'll be interesting. Anyways, just something that came up as we kind of started the site and was thinking about all these things. But I'll tell you what, man, it's sure is nice to have 3 webhooks in an API directory that are like 10 lines, and we already have all these features in it. It's pretty cool. So
Yeah.
it'll be fun to see how it keeps going. But next week, we're going to have the site up, and I think we'll talk about it here in the podcast just for early listeners if they want to take a look. So
Nice.
that'll be fun.
Nice.
Awesome. Okay, that was a pretty good discussion.
That's awesome.
Yeah, let's wrap it up.
Cool.
All right, thanks for listening, guys. We'll see you next week.
See ya.
Bye.